Hello again, welcome back, and I am here with our second EK, SPS 7A2. And in this one, we're going to be talking about the impact of industrialization on two specific factors. The first is on food supply and population changes. And this connects back to what we've talked about in Unit 5, as well as in the prior EK, that the second agricultural revolution was going on at the same time that the Industrial Revolution was, and they were feeding into each other. The technologies from the Industrial Revolution were being used in agriculture in ways that helped to improve production, and then the improved production helped to make it possible for industrialization to happen, both with the increase in population and also the changes in agriculture. So crop rotation practices, speaking of agriculture, as well as the creation of larger farms made it possible for people to produce more food more efficiently. And mechanized farming equipment made planting and harvesting even more efficient as well. And then the introduction of new types of fertilizers like guano and treated manure all combined to help increase the volume of food that was being produced. And since more food was being produced, people's diets improved. It became less and less likely that people were going to starve to death or experience famine. But it is important to note that even with that improved volume of food and improved nutrition, people that were poor, especially the urban poor, were still very much dealing with food insecurity from time to time. But this new volume of food and the new transportation technologies made it possible for food to be easily brought into cities to feed urban dwellers. So with the increased volume, you also see better nutrition, and better nutrition combined with better sanitation and medicine at the same time that this is going on helped to increase the amount of population because people had more kids and people had longer life expectancies and were generally healthier than they had been in the past. One thing that is important to note, though, like I said, urban dwellers are still at a risk for food insecurity, even with these changes. And widespread malnutrition and periodic famine still happened, but those types of problems were more connected to access issues and food distribution issues and cost rather than food scarcity itself. What that kind of means is that there is plenty of food, but whether or not you can get to that food and whether or not you can afford the food is still a problem. Now, this continued trend of populations increasing in cities led to more and more workers being available to work in factories, which continue to fuel the Industrial Revolution. And those population changes also meant that you saw more and more rural to urban migration because more and more people were being pushed off the land and into cities. Now, that kind of leads to changes in social structure. And when we're talking about changes in social structures, one of the things you want to think about is that prior to the Industrial Revolution, most people were rural, a lot of people were farmers, the majority were farmers. But the Industrial Revolution and the Second Agricultural Revolution changed that. What we see is that more and more people are being pushed off the land because it's being consolidated by wealthy farmers, and they don't need the agricultural labor anymore. So people are leaving agriculture and going into other things, and they're going into cities. And as more and more people are concentrating in cities and towns, we see social classes starting to shift. It is important to note that this process of rural to urban migration in really big waves is something that happens whenever an area industrializes. And it's currently happening now in some periphery and developing countries that have just started to industrialize in the last few decades. We're seeing that same process where people are being pushed off the land and out of farming and into cities. Now, what the different kind of social classes that we see popping up include commercial farmers. And this would be those wealthier farmers and landowners that could afford to buy that excess land and expand their holdings to acquire larger and larger farms, and then also could afford to buy the machinery necessary to work that land. They start to shift from what was considered to be like a gentleman farmer or a landed farmer into commercial farmers who produced a lot more agricultural product than was necessary for subsistence and selling it at market. So we see this shift from subsistence to commercial farming happening. And oftentimes these farmers might become specialists in a certain element of agriculture, like they might be sheep farmers or they might be market gardeners, and their purpose is to produce in order to sell. Another group that pops up, or at least expands, is the middle class. So the middle class had existed for centuries, but they were very, very small until the Industrial Revolution. And one of the reasons why that changes is because we see more and more demand for what are called white collar jobs. And a white collar job is where, you're doing office work, or you are an educated individual who does, things like law or medicine or education, or they're shopkeepers, or they are merchant class, or they're office clerks. And this group of people starts to expand more and more and more, especially as the cities expand. And the kind of characteristic here is that the middle class is sort of, as you might imagine, in the middle between the lower class and the upper class. So there are elements of their lifestyle that kind of mimic the upper class. They might have some servants. They may occasionally buy, dresses that are handmade or suits that are handmade. They may be able to go out and experience kind of the life of the city, the amenities. So like going to theaters and going to museums and things like that. But they don't have the money to be completely work free. The men still have to work, but the women don't. And they are comfortable without being rich and without being poor. However, there are some very, very rich people that pop out during the Industrial Revolution, and these are the capitalists who are newly rich. They used to be either former working class or middle class people, or in some cases, farmers, who became factory owners or investors and got wealthy during the Industrial Revolution because of the changing economy. But the interesting thing here is that they become, in some cases, incredibly wealthy, like millionaires, but they don't have the social status in places like Europe to be considered high class, even though they got a bunch of money. And so what we see here is in Europe, there's this kind of balance of what's called, the capitalist class and then the aristocracy. And those are the ones that have titles, Lord so-and-so, and, Duke, whatever his name is. And that's a different class of people that's been around since, well, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in a lot of different cultures. But industrialization introduces this class of people that are oftentimes significantly wealthier than the aristocracy, but don't have the social status, even though they have the money. Nowadays, it's shifted more, like our modern society, at least in the Western world, cares more about the money than they do about the title, although the title is still important within certain circles. It doesn't have the power that it used to. And the Industrial Revolution is one of the big things that really changes that. The last group is the industrial urban working class. And you can kind of see an example down here. This would be the urban working class. You can see the textile factory. Those are those big spools of yarn back there. And these are people that had either themselves been pushed off of agricultural land or whose families had in prior generations. They've moved to the cities, and instead of producing things for sale themselves, they are working for somebody and selling their labor in exchange for wages. And that's basically the idea that you go to work, you do the work, you get paid for the work, but you are not producing something to sell yourself, okay? So they are laborers within the bigger system, but they do not own the product of their labor, okay? They get paid for the labor. And this group becomes very, very large, exploited very heavily in some cases, and not as poor as you'd expect them to be comparatively, but like very poor considering like our standards of living today. But this is actually the beginning of increased standards of living across the board. And you guys will learn way more about this when you guys get into world history next year. And I could literally talk about the Industrial Revolution for hours, but I will stop now, at least for this EK, and I'll be back with you guys shortly to finish out this topic. As always, if you have questions, let me know.